which is a small town just near the Vietnamese border.
What are you doing there?
Writing and editing. It's basically just a really cheap place to live with easy visas. So if you do what I do and you're writing books and you're not making a lot of money, it's a much better environment than living back in Scotland, which is where I'm originally from, where there's no way I could pay for rent there doing what I do, so I'd have to find another job and then write on the side instead of doing this full time.
Okay, so what tell tell my listeners what you do full time. Like you're editing Beatdom magazine, is that right?
Yeah, so I'm the editor of Beatdom Literary Journal, but I also edit other people's books. We have a publishing imprint called Beatdom Books. We focus on just the beat generation, but also kind of expand out to related countercultures or any mid 20th century American literature, such as Hunter Thompson, occasionally Charles Bukowski. So yeah, I do that. I also write articles and essays for other people and do a little bit of freelance editing as well.
What do you pay in rent in Cambodia, may I ask? Like what's the ballpark, just so people listening can get a sense?
You promise you're not going to get angry when I tell you?
No. Maybe.
So I have a really nice big house with a garden and a field, and I pay $300 a month.
Good for you.
Yeah, yeah. You don't get that many places in the world. And I
Okay, so
overpay as well.
well, okay, but how did you sort this out? Like how did you land on this particular? I know it's like easy visas and the cheap rent, but like
Mm.
this isn't the only place I would imagine in the entire world where this is the case. Like how did a Scottish guy wind up in Cambodia?
Yeah, so long, long time ago, I came here on a holiday and just fell in love with the country. And about a year later, I was so in love with it, I actually moved back here and lived. This would have been 10 years ago. And I moved to a town called Sihanoukville and I started an Irish pub. So a Scottish guy with an Irish pub in Cambodia. And I did that for a little over a year, maybe 13, 14 months. And then I went and got a job for a university in England, but they just sent me to China to lecture there. So I left for about 6 years. And it was just at the very, very start of COVID. So it was the beginning of March 2020. I was in Thailand, where I'd been living for about a year at that time. And it became really obvious there are going to be all these lockdowns, borders are going to close. And at that stage, I'd been researching a book for 2 years and I knew I had to write it. So I just needed a place to live that would be safe, that would be hassle free, that would be in this really wonderful, beautiful environment. And most importantly, a quiet and cheap place where I could just write all day, every day. And so Cambodia was right next door, and I knew of it from having been here, having lived here before. And so it seemed like the perfect place. And it was. We got incredibly lucky during COVID. We never got our first wave of COVID until after everyone was vaccinated. And we had I think the highest vaccination rate in the world as well. So it really didn't affect the country that much.
Wow, look at you.
Lucky, yeah. Very,
Good for
very
you.
lucky.
Are you there on your own, or do you have a significant other with you, or friends, or anything?
I have three cats.
Okay.
Yeah, I have friends. Yeah, I have friends, but I live alone.
Okay. And how did you get into, before we get to Hunter Thompson, just to give listeners a little bit of background and to satisfy my curiosity, like you've been on, if I can use this word, you've been on this beat, like the beat,
Yeah.
for a long time, like an earnest fan of beat literature and like a kind of a beat historian, I would say you are, and maybe a countercultural literary historian, American counterculture, maybe not just American, but a lot of American
Mostly American.
counterculture writers. Yeah. How did you get into this?
Um, I don't exactly remember, but I know approximately. I was at university. I was studying American literature, which I kind of just done out of interest. But I mean, study American literature, and you're doing Ralph Waldo Emerson and whatnot. But one of my friends gave me a copy of Kerouac's On the Road and a copy of Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. This really blew me away. I thought it was just fantastic. And it would have been in about May of 2007. And I was just about to graduate from university and realized that I was probably going to end up working in a supermarket or something. There weren't any jobs, there weren't any opportunities, especially in publishing then. And I just decided to start Beatdom, which at the time was envisaged as a sort of glossy magazine inspired by the Beats, but taken into this millennium, but eventually evolved into a literary journal. Just by doing that, I found myself even more drawn into the Beats and their writing, and connecting with all the other people in the world who are really interested in the Beat generation, and sort of trying to turn Beatdom into almost a sort of community enterprise of Beat studies. And last year we had our 15th anniversary, which was a nice surprise, and it's still going strong. At the end of last year, we published a book by Bill Morgan, who's kind of the biggest name in the Beat studies world. I think it was his 25th or 26th book as well.
Oh my God. So how do people read the journal? How can people find it?
So the first 9 editions, the first 9 issues, I guess, are probably not available anymore, but everything since then is in print and in digital form. We really experimented with a bunch of different forms. Originally it was this huge glossy magazine, and now it's a much smaller black and white publication, although it's sort of increased to about 250 pages, so each issue's like a book. We don't sell through our website anymore. It was logistically a massive headache to do that, and so we pretty much sell through Amazon and a couple of bookshops around the US. But we've got readers all over the world. We've got a lot of readers in the Netherlands and Japan for some reason, and
Really?
so we sell in those places. Yeah. I say for some reason they have quite a big Beat studies community in both countries, so maybe that's not so surprising.
And how often does the journal come out?
It should be every May the 1st, so once a year, although we're on our 23rd issue in 15 or 16 years, because in the beginning it came out twice a year for a little while. Last year we published 2 months early because it was the 100th anniversary of Jack Kerouac, of his birth, and so we wanted to release on his birthday just to celebrate that. And sometimes we're late. Usually that's my fault, just being slow in my own contribution to the journal typically. But yeah, May of every year is when we go and sell.
Right. Well, and I feel like people should know too that you and I go back, I mean, God, it would be 16 years we've known each other online. You were a longtime contributor to the Nervous Breakdown, my online lit site.
Yeah.
I think that's where we met, and now this is the first time we've ever actually spoken. So it's a momentous occasion.
Yeah. I think in about 2009, you asked the contributors of the Nervous Breakdown to record a voice thing saying like, "Hi, I'm such and such. This is the Nervous Breakdown," or something. So that's probably the only time we've really. I mean, I've listened to your podcast, so I've heard you talk, but that's probably the closest we ever came to actually sort of speaking to one another.
Wow! And you were telling me before we got on online, you were telling me that you have suffered 3 significant concussions and dengue fever in the last year. Is this correct?
So I should clarify, 2 bad concussions and a third, but the third came a couple of days after one of the others, so it sort of exacerbated it. Yeah, I had COVID a few times and also got dengue fever. So Yeah, I was just saying I hope I don't forget too many names and dates and whatnot, because it
Okay.
definitely affected my memory quite a bit in the sort of months after each of the concussions. They're frightening things. I'd never experienced one before last year.
You got to take care of yourself. 3 concussions is too many.
I was keeping fit. I mean, I was trying to take care of myself. That's the actual purpose of what I was doing when I got concussed. I was trying to be healthy. You know, I'm getting older. Got to stay fit.
What were you doing when you got these concussions?
Playing foot, playing football, yeah,
Okay.
or
And you what?
soccer. Yeah.
You got tackled, like somebody like knocked you to the ground and you got concussed, or was it the ball?
So this is the embarrassing part. Yeah, it was the ball. The first one was a ridiculous freak accident, just getting hit very hard from on the dead center of the back of my head, and the third one was just in the temple. And the second one, it wouldn't have. The second one probably wouldn't have done anything if I hadn't had the first concussion. So
Damn.
just being very unlucky. Yeah.
And what about dengue fever? I don't know anything about that. What does it feel like when you have dengue fever?
Um, you know when all your bones are breaking at exactly the same time?
Not personally, but I can
They
imagine.
they call it bone break fever, so it's like that. It's a very you run a very high fever, your joints hurt, your bones hurt, and you just feel like crap for about a week. But
Damn.
it's not really deadly or anything, so it's yeah. It
And
in this
plus,
part of the
it
world it's
sounds
just
kind of
something you
cool.
get.
It sounds kind of cool that you can tell people you had dengue fever too. You know, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it is an exciting one. I can cross that off the list. Next, I'm hoping to get malaria. So,
I'm pulling for you. We're rooting for you to get malaria next. But
thank you.
let's talk. Let's talk about Hunter S. Thompson. There's so much to
All right.
discuss here, and I think maybe the place to begin is with the title of your book, which I
Hmm.
think is a very apt title for any biography of Hunter S. Thompson, but in particular a biography of Hunter S. Thompson that has the focus that yours does,
Hmm.
which is to say, I think you're really focused on the literary genre that he created and the literary style that he created
Hmm.
and maybe destroyed. uh, like that is the crux of it. So, what is a high white note?
Um, well, I mean, his own definition of it changed so much. When I actually get to the part of the book which I was rereading yesterday, where I'm discussing the high white note, and I'm trying to explain that for him, he kept redefining it, and he even kept getting it wrong. He kept saying it was the high white sound, the high white noise, the high white fusion. But basically, it means a moment of pure brilliance. And in terms of writing, he means it as a, a sentence or a passage, maybe a paragraph that that has some special quality. Usually, he was looking for something musical. So the sort of passage that if you read it aloud, and he loved to have his work read aloud by other people, or especially by his famous sort of Hollywood friends, that it's got a special resonance. Now, the way that this functioned in his writing is he believed you could have passages that were just dull, but if you suddenly have this one little bit that's absolutely magnificent, that sounds incredibly beautiful, that's a high white note, and that's kind of what he aimed for in his writing.
Okay, so maybe we should just let's have you read what I think most people who read Hunter Thompson would agree is a high white note. It's the passage from Hell's Angels that is often quoted and memed or whatever, but I think an example of him at his finest.
So this would be the beginning of Hell's Angels, which was his first book. He says, California, Labor Day weekend. Early with ocean fog still in the streets, outlaw motorcyclists wearing chains, shades, in greasy Levi's roll out from damp garages, all-night diners, and cast-off one-night pads in Frisco, Hollywood, Bordeaux, and East Oakland, heading for the Monterey Peninsula north of Big Sur. The menace is loose again, the Hells Angels, the 100-carat headline running fast and loud on early morning freeway, low in the saddle. Nobody smiles, jamming crazy through traffic and 90 miles an hour down the center stripe, missing by inches. Like Genghis Khan on an iron horse, a monster steed with a fiery anus, flat out through the eye of a beer can and up your daughter's leg with no quarter asked and none given. Show the squares some class. Give them a whiff of those kicks they'll never know. So a very unusual passage, a strange way to begin a book, but he was determined not to have this dull sociology kind of effort that just explains the Hells Angels. He wanted to capture them artistically if possible, and with writing that reflected the idea of the wild and free motorcycle gang.
Yeah, and I think, we talk about high white notes. And as I, finished reading this book, which I think whenever you read a biography, there's a certain level of, I don't know if fatigue is the word, but when you read an entire life, at the end of it, it's like, man, you've really been on a journey. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you go from, especially the person's dead, you go from usually from birth to death. So at the end of it, it's like, whoa. And in particular, I think when the person being written about had self-destructive tendencies and a mercurial temperament and a wild life, it might heighten that effect. And so what I was thinking to myself after I finished was kind of twofold. One, that he basically wrote the way he lived. He was a drug addict and he lived to get high, basically. And that ruined, I think, his instrument, after a time. There's diminishing returns with that. You can't live the way that he lived and be a writer of serious prose. It just doesn't work. But when he was at his best, he was so excellent. And when he was at his worst, he was terrible, which you are unsparing in this book when it comes to criticizing him, which I appreciated, because it's like you say, it's not a hagiography. You're a fan of his best work, but you're not a fan of his worst work, and you're honest about that. And I think the second thing that I came away with after reading the book was that, for me anyway, what he did was enough, because what he did was true to who he was. Like, that's just who the guy was. There is a lot of hyperbole, I think, bandied about when it comes to artists, and especially male artists, and maybe in particular white male artists of a certain generation, even when it comes to like the wild man literary figure or the wild man artist or rock star, who whatever it is. And I think a lot of the times it's just bullshit. Like, Mick Jagger is a genteel knight, who I think likes the finer things in life and is kind of a nerd, really, if his Instagram is any indication. Maybe Keith Richards is the real wild man. I think Keith, even though he has a very gentlemanly quality too, when you actually sit down to listen to him, he's a very thoughtful fellow. But if there is a wild man in the Rolling Stones who's authentically wild, it was Keith Richards. And I think that the authentic wildness of Hunter Thompson is something that needs to be noted. There was a lot of persona, as you describe, and there was a lot of acting to his act, but at his core, this was who he was. He was a little bit crazy, right?
Yeah. I tried to have that woven through the book, and because it was there throughout his biography. I mean, as a child, he was very intelligent. I think people immediately knew this is a smart kid, but he's an asshole. He was a bully. He was horrible to people around him, but he was also really charismatic. And if he wanted you to like him, you would like him, because he would make himself that lovable, that impressive. I, I don't like when people sort of play, what's the expression, an armchair psychologist or whatever. But I mean, you read this book and you think he might have been a like psychopath in that sense, the charming but sadistic kind of person. I think when you speak to his friends, his family, anyone who knew him, they seem to be speaking about two distinct people as well. You've got the very intelligent, eloquent, and endlessly hard-working writer against just this awful, petulant, childish, bullying, sadist version of himself. So I think there were two distinct sides to Hunter. But then, as you mentioned, he was also, I think, he viewed himself as this character that he knew would be his literary focus one day, even before he was a writer, and he was determined to make himself into a character that people would want to read about. He studied outlaws. I mean, actually had books about outlaws and made notes on how to be one, so that he could play that role. And from the very beginning of his writing career, you can see him trying to push himself into the narrative, whatever he was writing about, even if it had no call for a random outlaw journalist to appear. He was seeing what could he get away with. And of course, when he suddenly shot to fame in 1970, it was natural he was going to push himself more and more into that role. I think if you've got a bit of an ego and it starts to get fed from all these people hero worshipping you, then it's going to become worse and worse. Speaking of which, you mentioned my criticism of his work. Uh, he's always been the closest thing I have to a literary hero. I really do love his best work, but I was trying to be as objective as possible when I analyzed his work, and that has quite pissed off a lot of Hunter Thompson fans, because they don't necessarily want to see the reality behind the image that he crafted. He spent all these years making himself the bad boy of literature, and nowadays he has a pretty significant fan base. I think I read at some point, like, he's got more people read Hunter Thompson than pretty much all of the Beat generation combined. And yet, I wonder how many people have really read more than the first few pages of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I think they just like dressing up as him for Halloween and taking lots of acid. These were the people, even the title of my book really pissed them off. They said, "The Rise and the Fall?" There was no fall. He was always perfect.
Yeah, I think that this is part of what your book tries to resolve as well, is that there was this persona that he himself created. Like you say, he inserted himself into his stories and into his work, and he self-mythologized in the way that artists often do. And then he became a prisoner, in essence, of that persona, and it kind of led to his ruin in a lot of ways. But what gets lost in all of that, and what frustrates me as a deep reader of his and a big fan, much as yourself, is that I feel like the clown image, Hunter Thompson as the literary outlaw or the gonzo freak, with a head full of acid, people, glom onto that, and they miss what a gifted writer and what a sharp intelligence he had at his best. To be truly funny and to also be writing literary fiction or nonfiction is rare. I don't think it happens all that often. I don't read writers who do what Hunter Thompson was able to do very often. And I think you're on board with that sentiment, right? Like he was at his best a great one.
Yeah, yeah. And part of why I wrote this book was I wanted to understand, like, how he managed to do it, how he managed to. Well, if you look at Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, it's just a laugh out loud book. Even if I've read this 100 times by now, I'll pick up a page, open it, and just be laughing on the floor at something he said. I was very interested in how he managed to do that because I always had this feeling he's a great writer. He's misunderstood. People just think of him as a clown, as a silly writer, but he is phenomenally talented. And he did spend the first decade and a half or 2 decades of his career studying his art, studying his profession to become as good at it as he possibly could, and then to become as original as he possibly could. And when you start closely reading the likes of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, you can see just how fine of a control he had over language, how well he knew what he was doing. And I don't think he gets enough credit for this. So I kind of wanted to write this book from about a year after he died. He died in 2005. I didn't have the skill, the knowledge, the resources, the time to do it until a couple of years ago. But through all that time, I felt it was just criminal that no one was taking him seriously. He really was just, well, I know we've said it several times, but a literary clown. He's someone that you have a poster of on your wall, except it's not him, it's Johnny Depp dressed up as him. I wanted there to finally be a book that takes him seriously, criticizing when necessary, but also digging into and studying how he became such a great writer. And to do that, you have to look back to the people he was obsessed with, the Fitzgeralds and Hemingways and Don Levy's and whatnot, because he considered being a writer to be absolutely the most important thing, and it was his goal in life. And he worked tirelessly until he achieved the very highest level he could.
So just to dial back a little bit to when he was young, like you mentioned that his talent and intelligence was evident to those around him from the jump, and that he had the charm and maybe like the sociopathology and this kind of bipolar personality and evidence then as well, where he could be incredibly winning one moment, but then cutting and violent and sadistic the next. And, you know, as a young man in Louisville, Kentucky, he was, I think, liked by his classmates. He was like, I think you described him as being funny without telling jokes. He had that wild thing happening even back then. He liked to like throw rocks at people, and then I think start race wars. Like, what was going on? Because I mean, this was Louisville in the mid 20th century, right? So I mean, there was, you know, it was a pretty volatile time in that sense.
Yeah, that would have been the 1940s and possibly up to the early 50s. Yeah, he was a hellraiser, to use that term. I think he just had so much intelligence and energy that it wasn't really given any sort of creative outlet, and so he was just bursting at the seams. He kind of drew people towards him, and they worshipped him and would do whatever he would tell them. So he was always the leader of his own little gang and whatnot. But from that early age, you could see he was a bad kid, but he was incredibly creative about it. The things he did, it wasn't normal, just teenage or childish misbehavior. He was engaged in the weirdest pranks, like having his friends faking seizures and things. He loved setting fire to anything. He was just an absolute arsonist, but he would do it in the most bizarre ways, of creating these little devices on his bike that he could set fire to piles of leaves in just the right way that they wouldn't actually catch fire until he was on the other side of town. There's something in one of the biographies that said he was believed to have been behind a spate of vandalism attacks. So I went back and I got all the old Louisville Courier back issues from that era, and I was reading through the reports from the police, and knowing how his life went, knowing who he was and what he was like, it becomes so ridiculously obvious that he was behind the whole thing. I mean, to the fact that they said at the scene of the crime, they kept finding empty fire extinguishers. And if you've ever typed Hunter Thompson into YouTube or whatever, you'll just see thousands of videos of him shooting fire extinguishers in people's faces. It was a lifelong obsession. But yeah, I think his mother pushed him to read a lot. And at a certain point, he decided he was going to start writing, and that was an outlet, and I think that directed him away from, I don't know, spending the rest of his life in prison, as certainly looked to most of the people that knew him.
So I think another thing that we need to point to when we talk about young Hunter Thompson is the fact that his father died when he was 14.
Mm.
And what was it? Myasthenia gravis, I think. It's like a neuromuscular disease, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you remembered the name. Not sure how. I guess I was writing that down. I've never even said that aloud. Yeah, horrible, horrible, painful disease, and he died. And that obviously, as it would affect anyone, that affected him hugely. But in parts, I mean, he was so wild that his mother couldn't really control him that well, and his dad, who was very standoffish as a parent, would always step in for the disciplining aspects and would beat him pretty badly with a I guess a belt or something like that, and that kind of almost kept him in line. And as soon as his dad was dead, he just became uncontrollable. And when his dad died as well, his mother became an alcoholic. And Hunter was nothing if not a hypocrite. And despite him being an alcoholic and spending much of his life doing that, he despised seeing women drink, and despised seeing people being unable to hold their drink. And so he really came to hate his mother for a period. They made up later. According to his brother, I think he pushed his mom down the stairs at about that point as well. So a pretty volatile and unpleasant home situation.
Yeah, well, I think that also just a deep wound, maybe the deep wound of his life
Mm.
because it happened in childhood that I'm not sure if he ever fully recovered from. Not that I don't know if that's the word. You never really recover from those kinds of losses, but I just feel like it was a traumatic experience for
Mm.
him. And he was not a guy who was prone to self-investigation or self-expression when it came to his deepest pains. Like these aren't things that he wrote about, despite being somebody who wrote so much.
Yeah, I mean, you look through his entire career, and when did he ever get personal? When did he ever talk about his own emotions? Just never really did it. I think it's interesting you said that because in order to get over the death, not that you would get over exactly, you have to process it. You have to go through that. I think he just lashed out at the world and then went off in his explosive life. I don't think he ever really did come to terms with it in that way. I don't think he's the sort of guy that would have opened up with his friends, with his family, with anyone about it. So he probably kept that burning away beneath the surface throughout his whole life.
Yeah, and you can understand. It makes it make sense to me, I guess, that he would have lashed out in other ways, or that the emotional trauma and tumult that he was experiencing and internalizing so deeply, it would have led to some combustible situations, like behaviorally. Like it has to get out somehow, right? It's like steam escaping a kettle or something. Like you can't just hold all of that in. So it gives me like some understanding that he had this deep grief as a young boy, like just at the dawn of adolescence, really, and then kind of goes wild and starts lighting Louisville on fire.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. That's interesting because I mean I think most people look back to when he was very very young and just see these twin threads of brilliance and delinquency, of anger. But yeah, certainly that the death of his father would be an event of incalculable importance in creating him as the angry man that he pretty much always was.
And a guy who's going to live life on his own terms and is going to be ungovernable. Maybe that was in him anyway, but I think when you lose somebody close to you, or you see death up close at that age, might have an impact, I guess, on certain people anyway. And that's how I make sense of him. And then the other way that I think I make sense of Hunter Thompson's formation, as it unfolded in his youth, has to do with class. And, here was this really intelligent, really sensitive, really volatile, really wounded teenage boy who was kind of from the wrong side of the tracks, especially with the loss of his father. Suddenly the financial situation at the Thompson household took a pretty serious nosedive. And yet Hunter Thompson joined the Athenaeum Literary Society of Louisville. I think he was, exhibiting literary talent even then, and was gravitating toward books, and then joined up with this, this literary society. I don't know about these kinds of things. We didn't have anything like this when I was a kid, but it sounds like the upper crust of Louisville, the kind of thing that kids who go to prep schools and wear coats and ties to school would go to. And he was mixing with these people, and they kind of considered him I think you called him like the token anti-intellectual. They kept them in their midst because he was charming, but they definitely treated him like an outsider. He was not accepted as one of them fully.
Yeah. I think that's the exact phrase I used. He was, a sort of mascot to them. I think he was entertainment. He was. His family, they scraped by. They weren't affluent at all when his father was alive, but they had this kind of lower middle class existence. But he was mingling with the wealthy people because they looked at him and thought, what the hell is this guy? He's just fascinating. He's weird. He's explosive. He's funny. And so that was his sort of entry to this society that was kind of beyond him in normal social terms. And they also, they definitely saw his talent because he was invited to join this literary organization, the Athenaeum. But partly he was invited to join that because he just created his own sort of rival one a couple of years earlier. And I think that just impressed the people that ran the real one, which, I don't remember when it was started, but it was in the 19th century anyway. But he quite quickly ended up with a lot of rich friends, and he got in trouble with them just before his high school graduation. Turns out some of them were a little worse than he was, and they were out late one night, and one of his richer friends robbed two couples who were sitting in a car, and Hunter was the one who was trying to calm the situation down, and he was the one that was sent to jail in the end, and he missed his high school graduation because he was sitting in a jail cell. But his two friends got off because they were more privileged, basically. One of them, his father, was a lawyer. Hunter saw this as a tremendous injustice. Even though he was actually sent to jail, the judge at the case had seen Hunter in his courtroom, I guess probably every week or month for a couple of years, and he'd heard over and over again, "No, Judge, I promise I'll change. You'll never see me again." And I think this was just the final time when he said, "No, you're being punished not for what you did this time, but you're being punished for all the stuff you've done before this." I can't remember the judge's exact words, but he said something to the effect of, "I've done you a disservice by waiting this long to take action," and threw him in jail for 60 days. And Hunter, tremendous injustice to him. He overlooked the fact that his rich friend's lawyer dad was actually defending Hunter as well and trying desperately to get Hunter off. But that was another formative experience. Like you mentioned, the death of his father. I think through his entire life, he really bore a grudge over the fact that he missed his graduation. His high school graduation was in jail, and he purely saw that as a class thing.
Yeah, and it was a betrayal, and it burned in him, I think, like you say, for the rest of his life. And he did have his revenge eventually, which we will talk about. But before we leave Louisville and before we leave Hunter Thompson's youth, I think it's as good a time as any to talk about Hunter Thompson and race, or to finish talking about Hunter Thompson and
Mm.
race, because like so many, like boomer, or I don't even know if he was a boomer, maybe he was silent generation or whatever he was, but men from the mid 20th century, white men from the 20th century, and writers in particular, like Hemingway was like horribly anti-Semitic, in his work, and you could just kind of see that it doesn't age well. Hunter
Mm.
Thompson is a kind of a complicated figure in this regard, because he would sometimes throw around the N-word. Yet, he went to see a speech by Thurgood Marshall. That was a formative experience for him. Muhammad Ali was his all-time hero. Not that this absolves him, but I'm just trying to say that his politics and his friendships, he was great friends with Ed Bradley, I know, in Colorado in his later years or whatever. So it's not a clean cut. He was a total bigot, but he did have kind of a messy relationship with it and could be insensitive. And I think that sensibility had to have been colored primarily by his upbringing in Louisville, which is a pretty southern town, right?
Yeah. So it is important to note, I mean, nothing excuses it, but he was very progressive for his time and for his part of the world. He thought racism was a terrible thing, and he believed himself to be very proudly anti-racist. Of course, that doesn't make you not racist, and especially looking back, we can see that whole era, and I think anyone that came from there would have been somewhat racist by today's standards. He wrote frequently about the stupidity of racism, and he kind of tied his own sort of geographic upbringing to racism, because as a young man he would go back and talk about Kentucky racism, and you can see it in one of his most famous works, the Kentucky Derby, is Decadent and Depraved. But of course, if you look back through his work, it is quite uncomfortable, and it was another difficult thing I needed to do in this book. I wanted this book to be the first that talks about Hunter and race, because again, it's something everyone just overlooked before this. But yeah, he did toss around racial slurs, and he did it for fun. He did it for a laugh. It was just a cheap joke. So sometimes he would be writing an article, and he would throw in a racial slur to show what an awful person someone was, and he would clearly condemn that. But in another article, he would just be using it to make fun, maybe of the person of color that he was laughing at. And again, it's just the two sides to him that don't even seem to match up at all.
I wonder, do you have any sense of, I mean, so many people, I think, who get heavy into drugs or self-medicating for an undiagnosed behavioral or mood disorder. That seems pretty likely with him. I wouldn't know what it was. I'm not going to armchair psych it, but is there anything, was he ever treated or diagnosed in any way as being bipolar or anything like that? Or
no, he wouldn't have. Yeah, I don't think he would have been open to that diagnosis at all. I think it would be very interesting to get a professional in that capacity to look back, look over his letters, look over his work, and sort of diagnose him now. I'm a little wary of doing that, although it's very, very tempting because he was such an interesting character. But yeah, I mean, when you've got someone that's got such an extreme personality and seems to have two quite distinct personalities, you do wonder how he would be medically categorized today.
Yeah. Well, after he leaves Louisville, he goes to prison, misses his high school graduation, and his ticket out is to join the Air Force. And this is where he begins his writing career. He begins, in particular, begins his career as a journalist. So let's talk a little bit about the Air Force and getting down to, what was it? I guess, was it Tallahassee? Where in Florida was the Air Force base?
It's Eglin Air Force Base by Destin.
Okay. So the Panhandle. And He's writing for the Command Courier, I believe, right? That was like the Air Force Base newspaper.
Yeah, it's now called the Eglin Eagle. I think it was called the Eglin Eagle before and after he was there, and I think by coincidence it sort of changed its name for the duration of his tenure. Yeah, it was the Command Courier. So he arrived there. It was kind of a convoluted process of getting moved from one Air Force base to another, and eventually he arrives there, and he thinks it's initially quite a nice place because you've got these huge white beaches that you can just go swimming at. But what really makes it for him is the fact that one day he's speaking with someone who mentions we need a sports editor for the, the base newspaper. And Hunter says, "Oh, I know sports, and I was a newspaper editor back in Louisville." And luckily for him, no one checked into that background that he gave. And he would do this for the rest of his life. He would just make up credentials. But no one checked. And about a month later, he was actually editing the sports page. And he was carrying around these books he got from the library about how you edit a newspaper and the newspaper terminology. This was really difficult for me because this was the last part of the research that I got for this book. I'd gone through everything. I spent 2 years researching the book, just all of every day, and I kind of believed those papers to be lost. And it was just at the very end, actually, after I'd even written the book, I found those newspapers and had to go back and insert that whole part and change a bunch of things in the book. But it's fascinating, and you really do see him developing. He begins with this very intuitive sense of language because he was a voracious reader, and so you can see he's just imitating other writers he's read and how he thinks language is supposed to be. But then he's off reading about grammar and learning how to actually punctuate things, and you can see how interested he becomes in the layout of the page and having photos to illustrate things. And he goes out and buys a camera and starts taking pictures to accompany his articles. And even back then, you can see his penchant for pissing people off and putting himself into his articles. He managed to get in trouble and was eventually kicked off the newspaper and kicked out of the Air Force. But you can see early on, I mean, he's got this. Yeah, so he wants to put himself into the article, which sounds so incredibly egotistical, and it is, but he was never doing it as the hero. He was never this big macho type. He was always just the comical loser. And so one of those early articles, I think he'd gone back to Kentucky to do the Kentucky Derby, and it was just about how he placed all these bets and lost, and he was just the worst gambler there ever was. But in other columns, he's kind of giving people gambling advice and whatnot. It was very amusing to see the origins of him, and it was there, of course. Yeah, he got his first actual journalism job and the experience that let him go on and do have the rest of his career.
So before we get to that, I think it's important to flag something you said just a minute ago about what a word freak he was from the jump. Like a technical curiosity about the language, grammar, how sentences work, how the layout of the paper was constructed. I mean, he had like a very voracious curiosity when it came to all of that stuff. And I think to a degree that distinguishes him. I think like writerly people tend to be word freaks in some way or another, but I know from having gone through an MFA program anyway, that like a majority of the people who went through that program didn't know how to use commas. I don't know if technical mastery along those lines is as common as people might think. There are a lot of people who love to write who don't really get into the minutia of the technical stuff of writing and who don't really like fetishize words to the degree that Hunter Thompson did. And I think it's important to note because it was so instrumental in the formation of his eventual style that everybody knows him for. I don't think that style is born if he doesn't have that degree of love for those details.
I think that there's so many people that worship Hunter Thompson and just tried to copy him. And what they don't understand is that he learned the language and then broke the rules. They're just cutting straight to the breaking the rules. I don't want to learn the language first. That's too difficult. So he had this, just as I said, an intuitive grasp of the language from having read very widely, but then he started studying very intensely how to actually use the language. And throughout his career, you can kind of chart him getting better at the technical aspects of writing and then dispensing with them, but doing it very consciously and doing it for a very specific effect. Yeah, it is interesting what you say about writers not knowing that stuff. As an editor, it does kind of shock me that writers use commas almost at random. I kind of assume myself, well, if you're going to be a writer, surely you should know how to write. Surely there should be a distinction between a storyteller and a writer, because writing should involve the technical aspects as well. But I think most don't really understand the intricacies of grammar.
Well, he did, and he takes what was a pretty good education for somebody who didn't go to college. He could have done much worse than to go off to the military and end up essentially as a journalist for a year in Florida and getting some experience that was above his weight. You know, he kind of hustled his way into that job and got experience that a lot of people his age with those kinds of inclinations would not have gotten and did not get. And then after I think he got an honorable discharge somehow from the military.
He did, yeah.
But it's interesting to me that they just kind of did away with him. They were like, you know what, we'll give you an honorable discharge. This isn't going to work out. That's really how it felt when I was reading that section. It wasn't contentious to the point where they were trying to keep him. They were just like, yeah, this guy's not cut out for military life. It was clear.
So he used his discharge papers in several of his books because he was so proud of them, because they said he's intelligent, he's a gifted writer, and he's such a rebel that the U.S. military has officially given up on trying to control him. And he thought that was the greatest honor there was. And
Yeah.
Indeed, it is quite impressive. But yeah, they realized it would be a huge waste of their time to keep him on base, to keep him working there, so they let him go. And when they did, he'd had that the entirety of his journalistic experience was, I think, just short of a year, maybe, working on a base newspaper. And he went off to New York and just immediately sent a letter to the New York Times. I'm here. I'm willing to work for you guys if you want me. Which obviously didn't pan out, but he did get a job at Time pretty quickly, although he was not working as a writer. He was just a copy boy, I think.
Like entry level, but still, Time Magazine, no college education. That's pretty good. And he also toyed around with going to Columbia, right?
And he did. He wasn't a full-time student there, but he took a few courses. When he was in New York, he was a big fan of the beat writers, and so he would have been aware of the history at Columbia, and certainly that was a place he was intent on going to and studying. I think when he was there, he was studying how to write short stories, and certainly over the next 2 or 3 years, he spent a significant amount of time working on his fiction, but that never really developed in the way that his nonfiction did.
Okay, so speaking of his nonfiction, you and I think before we came on the air, were talking, and I think both of us love Hunter Thompson's letters. To me, they're my favorite thing that he ever wrote. I love Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I think that's probably the high watermark for his book projects. But the collected letters, especially The Proud Highway, which is the one, I think the first collection of his letters when he was young and hungry and developing. And then there's a second collection, I think, is it Fear and Loathing? The Fear and Loathing? I forget what the second collection's called.
In America, yeah.
Fear and Loathing in America. There might be a third collection, but I don't know if it's ever been in print. Has it? Because he trailed off so badly. But that first collection of letters and some of the second collection are so funny, and they demonstrate who he was as a person, as a friend, as a husband, as a father, you get kind of a window in, and it's obviously filtered through his mind, but it can be so funny, like so unbelievably funny. I also think that those letters, and you can, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like those letters were a laboratory for him, where he was honing the voice and kind of experimenting with language in a way that would later show up in his published books. And so, something that I want to have you read is a letter that he wrote to a prospective employer, because there was something wonderfully arrogant about him when it came to seeking employment, and how he spoke in writing to prospective employers, and how he spoke of journalism. I think he always had a complicated relationship with journalism, and in the work itself loved to take shots at the profession and at journalists for failing to maybe live up to the highest ideals of the profession. But let's just give listeners an idea of what it was like to get a letter from young Hunter Thompson as he showed up in town or showed up in your mailbox looking for work.
So this was a letter to the editors of the Vancouver Sun. So after admitting that he has very poor references and he's not willing to mingle with average people, and says that he has nothing but contempt for journalism, he goes on, "As far as I'm concerned, it's a damned shame that a field as potentially dynamic and vital as journalism should be overrun with dullards, bums, and hacks, hag-ridden with myopia, apathy, and complacence, and generally stuck in a bog of stagnant mediocrity. If this is what you're trying to get the Sun away from, then I think I'd like to work for you." I love the arrogance in that. It's like, I'm willing to lower myself to you, to your level.
Listen, it kind of worked for him, though. And I mean, it actually did work, I believe, with El Sportivo in Puerto Rico. As I recall, the letter that he wrote, some of the letters that he exchanged with William Kennedy, the author, who was at the time, the editor of El Sportivo, this like sports, right? What do you tell me? What was it, a sports magazine?
So Kennedy was the editor of the San Juan Star, and El Sportivo was this new magazine. So Thompson wrote to Kennedy and basically applied for a job at the Star with his usual "I'm going to insult you and then demand that you employ me," and it didn't work, but it did set off a lifetime friendship, because as it turns out, Kennedy was able to give as good as he got, and he just insulted the hell out of Thompson, which shocked and offended Thompson, but after a while they became pals. However, he did manage to get a job at El Sportivo, which I saw a couple of days ago. Someone found a copy of, and it's believed to be the only known copy that exists at the moment. Oh. And he got a job there. He went down to Puerto Rico and just immediately hated the job and wasn't a huge fan of the island either. His job was, I think, just writing fluff pieces for a bowling magazine. So go around the bowling alleys, find all the local guys, write about how great they are, and then they sell the magazine back to those same guys. So when he was down there, he began writing his novel, The Rum Diary, and worked on various articles for other newspapers that were more worthy of his time. But during those articles and during his letters, he was constantly, as we said before, he was workshopping language. So I tried to point out in this book many times that in his letters, in his small articles, the ones that he just did for money but didn't care too much about, you'd see him using a phrase or using a word or using a certain rhythm or device that he would then later repeat for something that he thought was more worthwhile. And for him, the only really worthwhile things were books. Originally, he wanted to be a novelist, and then later he wanted to sort of create this creative nonfiction form. But yeah, throughout his time in Puerto Rico, he was writing about what was going on around him. And when you actually read the Rum Diary, you can take chunks, even whole sentences from these old articles, and you can see how he just kind of copied them into his book.
Well, one of the things about your biography that impressed me so much was the depth and care with which you read his work
Mm.
and parsed for the reader how he developed his style and how he cultivated certain turns of phrase, certain words that appear over and over and over again in his work. Fear and loathing, pig fucker. What are some other ones? You know, I mean, I just was talking about this.
Atavistic, swine doomed.
Yeah, swine, doomed, all these things. Like as soon as you start to read a piece of Hunter Thompson's work, if you're familiar with him, it's always immediately clear that it's his. And you can't really say that about too many writers. Even good writers don't have such a discernible style. I think of a writer like Hemingway, who was a hero of Thompson's. Like he had a very clear style that everybody tried to imitate. Raymond Carver's another one. I mean, there are others, but there are some writers who do develop such a unique way of doing it that it really jumps off the page and is theirs. And another quality about it is that it tends to invite mimicry. People read it and they want to copy it, you know, and I'm guilty as charged with all of those guys. You know, like I do that, I think, with every writer I read whose style I really admire. I think it's natural. You internalize this and it somehow shows up in your work. You know, first you do it badly and then eventually it blends in with other stuff.
Yeah, and Hunter did that himself. You'd be hard pressed to really see the influence of his influences through his peak writings. But when you look at the whole process of how he developed that, you can see he started off by really just copying Hemingway, copying parts from Fitzgerald. Don Levy's The Ginger Man was a huge one. And he kind of took all this and blended it together, and then ultimately that turned into his own completely unique style of writing, which now people just copy. And I hope that at least some of them recognize that you start by copying him and then you move away from that into your own new style that's not so obviously linked to him. Because when you look at Gonzo, even more so than Hemingway, and I think Hemingway is probably the most copied writer of the 20th century, but you know, it's not unreasonable that people would write these short, sparse sentences that avoid the overuse of adjectives and whatnot. But when you talk about Hunter Thompson, if you have some random person talking about being doomed and this is atavistic and he's a swine and he's a pig fucker and and just running around taking acid and shooting stuff, it doesn't work because it's so obviously derivative. It's hard, and that's why I always say that Gonzo is a one-man genre. I don't think anyone else could do it because you would just be mimicking someone that did it first.
So singular. And I think too, like, you know, as a comedic character on the page, Huck Finn, Raoul Duke, there aren't that many. You know,
No.
I'm sure I'm missing some, but I mean, it's one of those. It's one of those. It's kind of like a one-off, and it's something that has endured, and it's become a Doonesbury character, you know, in the funny pages of the paper every day for years and years and years, and it has become a Halloween costume. You know, it's reached that level of iconic status.
Yeah, I think he was a victim of his own success in that regard. I mean, we've said already he became trapped by the Raoul Duke character. But he created something so brilliant that appealed to so many people that he was kind of taken over by it. I don't know if you've seen the BBC documentary Fear and Loathing in Gonzo Vision from 1978, where it's Thompson and Stedman hanging out in front of a BBC camera. And you can see him talking about how he's trapped and he doesn't want to be Raoul Duke anymore, and he doesn't understand why everyone expects him to be Raoul Duke. And yet he's running around in this flamboyant Hawaiian shirt and doing cocaine and just drawing attention to himself. And well, do you really not want people to see you? Or I don't know, maybe if you're the sort of personality that just needs attention, you'll do anything to get that attention. And he knew he'd stumbled onto something that guaranteed that he would always remain that icon.
It was a hit.
Mm.
It was like the Charlie Chaplin, the tramp character. You know, it's kind of that. it's not totally dissimilar. Or the Marilyn Monroe bombshell blonde comedic
Hmm.
character. Like it's of that ilk, kind of like the guy with the cigarette and the cigarette holder and the Hawaiian shirt with a head full of acid and cocaine walking through a casino in Las Vegas. Like that's a one-off, like you can't, it's kind of I don't know. It just feels to me like really great comic characters and comic novels just don't come along that often, and comic voices, like all of it has to coalesce. And for me, it really only did in Fear and Loathing in Vegas, and like in its perfect form. And then also in the letters, I think are sometimes as funny as that, and the language is as strong as that. The other books I don't get into quite as much. I like them, admire them,
Yeah.
but I don't get into them quite as much.
Yeah. There's also the Kentucky Derby article. I think, in a way, you can almost view Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas as just a massive rewrite of that on a different scene. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think his political journalism was brilliant in a different way, but definitely less perfect than Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I think he kind of attributed some of the brilliance of that to the fact that it's very short. It's 55,000 words. So it's condensed, and there's nothing in there for a book about excess. There's nothing in there that's really unnecessary, right? And that came from the fact that he was just trying to copy Fitzgerald again. He was trying to write his own version of Gatsby, which was also 55,000 words, I believe.
Hmm. Well, let's get to some of his other career achievements prior to Fear and Loathing. I think, I'm going to skip over some stuff in the interest of time, but I think that we have to at least touch upon the year that he spent in South America writing for the National Observer, because I
Hmm.
think from the perspective of his career as a journalist, this put him on the map. It was, I think, challenging to be there for him in a lot of ways. It wasn't always easy to live there and to be moving around and covering that beat. But the work that he did found him an audience and some admirers, and was reprinted in newspapers all over the country. And so it was a useful year for him, right?
Tremendously so, yeah. As you said, uncomfortable. I think he had hemorrhoids and various tropical diseases for the duration of his time there. He was constantly complaining, but when he was uncomfortable and unhappy, he was at his absolute best as a writer. And his letters from South America, he's writing about, he just saw a beetle the size of God's ass and things. It's just this wonderful, explosively weird imagery that he's conjuring up. But yeah, he when he was there, he had incredible amount of freedom because he was writing for the National Observer, which had started as the Sunday version of the Washington Post, and it then spun off into its own thing. The the editor originally, I think, just wanted people reading articles and then rehashing them through a new lens, but it was a disaster. And so when Hunter came along, they were in this state where they said, "We don't know what we're going to do. We're open to anything." And when I think it's Clifford Ridley was his editor there. When he read Hunter's stuff, he said it was just brilliant. It had to go in the newspaper. So don't know how much of it's true, but it's entertaining enough that I'm not going to ask too many questions. So Hunter was sending in these reports. He would take pictures of himself. He bought a camera. His grandmother had just died and left him some money. He would take pictures of himself and he would label it, "This is an American tourist on the beach in Rio de Janeiro," or something. Because again, he just wants his ego. He needs to be there. But from the offset, he started putting himself into this stories. I mean, I think one of the first reports, it just kind of begins with Hunter walking. He's got $12 in his pocket. He's got a $500 camera, which I don't know how much that is in today's money. And you see all these, what he described as Indians, just staring at him like, who the hell is this weird white man that's just appeared? And then travels across the continent, supposedly on boats laden down with beer or contraband whiskey and whatnot. A lot of the stuff he did write, it was pretty much made up. The image of this, he wanted to talk about the wealth gap and race relations, and so writes about sitting on the rooftop of this building watching an Englishman smacking golf balls into the slums, and the little details, like he does it with a 5 iron and he's drinking a gin and tonic. So you think, like, oh, this must be real. I mean, there wouldn't be so much details if he just made it up, right?
Right.
So he was able to kind of work on this blend of fact and fiction, which is really the most important thing about his writing going forward. That's kind of what Gonzo was. It was the writing something that is essentially true, but is maybe comprised of things that aren't true to create a greater truth, or to convey an idea more effectively than a traditional journalistic telling would do. And with the freedom he was given in South America by the National Observer, he was able to work that out for himself, and he would continue to do that throughout the rest of the 1960s.
Okay, so he gets back from South America, and again, I'm not going to get everything, but I guess what? I don't know if it was Big Sur before South America.
After
After, so
1963.
He's in Big Sur for a year, basically. Writes something that I think makes him persona non grata with the locals, and then,
Yeah.
but is mixing with literary figures. And when I say Henry Miller, Lionel Ole, like that sort of crowd in Big Sur, if you're familiar with that bit of literary history, he's kind of part of that scene. And I feel like at this period in Thompson's life, he began a period where I feel like he was a Zelig-like figure. He seemed to be everywhere. He was at the pranksters, parties at Kesey's house in La Honda. He was hanging out with the Hells Angels. He was in San Francisco for the Summer of Love, I think, or
Yeah.
right around that time. So he was kind of right where the action was.
And he foresaw it as well. He said years before, he said, when the next big cultural or political upheaval happens, it will be happening in San Francisco. So that's where I want to be. And so he went there. He originally he wanted to be in Big Sur, and he lived there for a while, but got kicked out after his article. He was also shooting a lot of things. His hunting in the middle of the night kind of pissed people off.
Yeah,
And
he
then
was
he went
hunting.
to
He was hunting wild boar, right? He loved to hunt wild
yeah.
boar in Big Sur.
There's a story that's not in the book, but I forget it. Something to do with Janis Joplin's dog might have been killed by his dog or something like that. I
Well,
don't remember. But
he always kept Dobermans, right? I felt like Dobermans were his dog, right?
yeah, he had quite a few of those, yeah, throughout his
Okay.
life. And so yeah, then he ended up in San Francisco, and yeah, he was at the center of it. He got to see Jefferson Airplane play. I think he had a big crush on Grace Slick. And yeah, then he was there he met Allen Ginsberg and Ken Kesey, and obviously the Hells Angels, because that's who he wrote his book about. So he was absolutely at the nexus of this massive countercultural moment, just had this incredible proximity to it. And you said he made his name in South America, which is true, but when he took it up to the next level, it was very much as the countercultural writer, sort of kind of translating the freaks for the normal, for everyday Americans. So he would write about what are the Beat Generation, what are the hippies, like who are these people, what do they do, and he was, as this big, tall, white guy who was very eloquent, he was able to kind of pass in these two circles. He could come off as this straight journalist temporarily, and then could go and drop acid or mescaline with a bunch of hippies. And so he was able to kind of explain this world for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And he was 6'3", right? He was a big dude.
Something like that, yeah. 6'3", I think.
And
Huge feet as well. I saw somebody the other day was on Instagram, had bought like Hunter Thompson's shoes. He's a collector, so they were a legit item. They're like boats. They're absolutely massive. The guy was, he was huge, and he had this weird ambling walk because one of his legs was longer than the other as well. And he tried to convey this in his writing. He'd always, even when it was totally unnecessary, he would bring himself in and describe his his physical stature, his clothes, everything, because he wanted you to remember him.
Hmm. Well, he works for an editor at The Nation named Carey McWilliams, who was instrumental in his development and who gave him, I think, the entree to, or the idea for writing about the Hells Angels, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he'd given Hunter this suggestion, a sort of tip off, and Hunter had pursued it and very immediately realized this is a story that needs to be told. Not that he necessarily had any sympathies for the angels to begin with, but he recognized this is a story that's been told from only one vantage point in the media, which is that the Hells Angels are just these absolute monsters. And as he kind of poked around in this, he discovered, yeah, they're monsters, but they're a different kind of monster to what's being reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so he wrote an article that was incredibly successful for the Nation. And I think it was about 3 days later he kind of woke up, and I think that's the moment his life changed forever, because his mailbox was just stuffed with offers to write books, to write articles, and these came from the sort of highest offices in the land in terms of journalism and publishing. And so he had the freedom then to kind of pick and choose what he would do next, and he decided he was going to write a book about the Hells Angels, and that became his first book.
He had a lot of courage, Hunter Thompson. You talk about his ability to move between worlds. Like he could go to a Kesey's house and drop acid with a bunch of hippies, but then he could also sit in the office of Carey McWilliams and get along with him. McWilliams was a pretty straight arrow, I think, at least by comparison, and then he could go infiltrate the Hells Angels and win their respect to whatever degree a journalist, I think, could win it. And maybe their temporary respect, because eventually they stomped him, beat the shit out of him, right? I mean, so to do that, though, and to be riding around on motorcycles at high speeds and to be sort of living on the edge the way that he did in terms of his substance abuse, I don't know. You have to be wired up a certain way, and he had it.
Yeah. Maybe just massive amounts of testosterone, quite possibly, but he was brave. I mean, as a young man, you see him getting in situations where he got the shit kicked out of him really brutally. And when he was riding motorbikes, he would crash very badly as well. And when he was with the Angels, he knew he could be killed or beaten at any moment. So he was brave. After deciding he was going to write about them, he just found out where they hung out and went and basically made a speech to them about how he wanted to give their side of the story. And the story goes essentially that they just thought there's no other journalist in the world that would have the balls to do this. And that's why they kind of worked with him. But I think they did like him as well. They recognized, here's a guy that likes to drink and stay up all night and take drugs like we do. And he was turning them on to Bob Dylan and other kind of music and whatnot. So they had a good time together. And yeah, as you said, eventually they stomped him, to use his words.
Right.
Although it's unclear to what extent he provoked that for the marketing purposes. So we don't really know. I don't think he ever told the same story twice, and the other people that were there all have different stories from each other. So it's kind of hard to know. It's like that with a lot of things in Hunter Thompson's life, and it made researching this book very difficult when you know that the subject of your book, who is often the only source, is just making up the story he wants people to know.
Well, and you also make an interesting point about the fact that he might have provoked a savage beating of himself for the purposes of self-mythology and book sales. That's a pretty long length to go to sell books. I don't know if there are very many writers who would be willing to take a beating from the Hells Angels, but I guess he may have been.
Some of the Angels have suggested that because he was very close friends with one or two of them and remained friends with them afterwards, that he might have deliberately provoked the beating, knowing that about 10 to 30 seconds later, one of them would step in and say, "That's enough." So he knew there was a limited scope for damage, comparatively speaking. It's still a murderous organization that could have actually killed him, but it's possible that he had some faith that he was going to be okay.
So, again, trying to sort of jump around in his timeline. Hell's Angels, the book, it's written, and then the Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved is before or after that?
So the book came out in 66 or 67, and the Kentucky Derby article was 1970.
Oh, okay. So there's okay.
Couple
So,
years later.
but I want to stop because there's something that maybe it was William Kennedy. Let me see. I think I might even have it here in my phone somewhere. It's a quote from William Kennedy, who said, and I'll read this bit. He said, "I noted the transformation of Hunter from a public personality for the first time when he was doing publicity for Hell's Angels in 1968. He was in New York, and he turned up with a cowboy hat and very bizarre sunglasses, bright red or green, glow in the dark. It was a costume for Halloween, and that persona was what he was after, that look. I asked him, 'What are you made up for? What are you trying to prove?' He had always shown up at my house wearing sweaters, slacks, clothes, not costumes. But now the image was foremost. I believe Hunter was captured by that persona, and that his writing was transformed. More and more, it was about that persona, not about what it used to be about. And it seemed he was reveling in it." So a lot of people might assume that the persona kind of took over once Fear and Loathing was published in Rolling Stone and became this national craze. But here's Kennedy saying that it was when Hell's Angels came out, which was a huge book. I mean, it was a big, roaring literary success by any measure. So it's not crazy that Hunter Thompson would have been basking in the glow of media attention and, you know, being publicly celebrated. But even then, he was doing the persona.
It might have been more. It might have been more of a defensive thing than basking. He was very uncomfortable with the publicity that came with the book, and he missed a lot of his media engagements and was absolutely shit-faced drunk for the ones that did go along, and he was nervous and would just struggle really, really badly with it. So it's quite possible that he dressed up maybe to kind of draw away from certain insecurities.
Was he shy?
Shy is definitely not a word that I think anyone's ever used with Hunter, but I think, you know, people deal with shyness in different ways, right? And certain men usually become very maybe macho or outgoing or clownish to compensate for their shyness. So it is possible, but certainly he didn't like it. He didn't like any of the media thing. I remember once someone asked him a question about the Hells Angels, and he said, "Well, why do you think I wrote the book? Don't ask me, just go read the book." And of course, it was a reporter giving him a sort of softball question, allowing him to promote his book, but he didn't get that or didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so, yeah, it is possible. That's why he started to dress up, and it certainly was for most people the moment when he became the caricature. However, it has been suggested that he'd maybe started to morph into that after coming back from South America. I think he started to wear clothes that would draw a bit of attention, potentially trying to brand himself, as we would say now, to kind of create your own sort of brand that people might identify and recognize with you, which I think he recognized as a journalist might help him somewhat, especially if you're going to cover the countercultural beat.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of Twain in the white suit, and then Tom Wolfe subsequently.
Tom Wolfe as well, yeah.
Hunter Thompson's buddy, new journalism, buddy, who wrote what, the electric Kool-Aid acid test and all that kind of stuff. He always wore the white suit too. So I don't know. It's the kind of thing I get. It's the kind of thing I have trouble imagining myself doing. That seems like a lot of work. I would feel like a fraud, I think, if I started like wearing an outfit that was meant to draw attention to myself.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. I think you do. You have that idea, and then pretty soon, maybe it would feel weird to not wear it. You might feel like you wouldn't be recognized, that you would have lost something of yourself.
Maybe I
I
should
think you
maybe I should
definitely
start maybe I should start wearing a white suit when I do the podcast at all times.
definitely you need a fedora as well, I think. So,
I don't know if I could put the headphones on. I think I just might wear a white tuxedo if I want to step up my game. But let's get from the publication of Hell's Angels, where I think the style of Hunter Thompson is beginning to show itself. There are high white notes in that book, as we have already
mm,
discussed. You read that bit earlier in the conversation, and this is one of the stronger nonfiction books published in the 20th century. It was a big to
definitely.
do. It sold a lot of copies, and it put him squarely on the map in the literary world. And yet, there was still work to do in terms of developing his style and creating what came to be known as Gonzo. And I think Gonzo first came into full flower with the Kentucky Derby is decadent and depraved. That's historically when people tend to when they tend to say it happened, correct? But I know that there were articles which preceded it, like the one about Jean-Claude Killy, the skier.
Yeah.
You know, there were previous articles that were kind of test runs and letters that were test runs. So it's a little bit inaccurate, I think, to say it just kind of came out of nowhere with the Kentucky Derby, but that's where it fully congealed maybe for the first time.
That's just where the name came from, really, because it was after that article that his friend Bill Cardozo said that's pure Gonzo, or that's totally Gonzo, and so that's where the name came from. However, as you said, by the Jean-Claude Killy article, which was 1969, he had basically put together everything that was Gonzo, and kind of the point of my book, at least the first half of the book, was how did Gonzo come to be? How did you create something so completely out there? It's a bizarre style of writing. How did it get put together? And between Hell's Angels and the Kentucky Derby article, it was a case of tinkering with things. Now he did I think it was a profile of Richard Nixon for his inauguration, where he kind of partnered up with, again, I think it was Cardozo. And this was the first time he'd had what you could call a sidekick, like another guy there just with him. And he decided this was a great device because it makes the narrative so easy. If you've got something that you want to say, have your sidekick say it, or have you say it to the sidekick. Just a nice little shortcut. So that was an important development for him. By the time he'd done the Jean-Claude Killy piece, um, he kind of got almost everything that you needed to have Gonzo put together. But with the Kentucky Derby article, it was the fact that he couldn't write it. He had this really bad case of writer's block, and he was in his hotel room, and Ralph Steadman, who was his sidekick for this one and who did the wonderful artwork and did so much Gonzo artwork later, Steadman had finished his drawings, and Hunter was just in absolute despair because he couldn't write. But when he was taking notes, he would just walk around with this big legal pad and he would just be scrawling down everything. But his notes were very detailed, and supposedly he just started ripping out his pages from his notebook and giving them to the assistant, who would take them off to the editor. And the editor was saying, "Yeah, this is great. Give us more." This is for Scanlan's magazine. This was in, and I strongly suspect that this story has been embellished a bit, like most of Hunter's, because the notes are very developed in the finished piece. So I think he typed them up and added bits and pieces. But basically, these notes provide this real sense of immediacy. And that was the final piece in the Gonzo puzzle, was immediacy. Kind of like live tweeting today, I guess, the sort of unedited or supposedly unedited reportage that seeks to kind of bring the reader right into the event that's being described in a way that would otherwise not be possible. And so the article was a huge success. After he'd written it, Hunter Thompson felt terrible. This is a massive failure. I've squandered all my talent. I've had all these big breaks and I've lost it all. But people absolutely loved it. And after that, he decided, well, Gonzo is just what I do. Gonzo is going to be my style from now on. And that worked for the next 2 years, but unfortunately, he became very much trapped by that.
Yeah, and so what comes after it is Fear and Loathing. Maybe not immediately, but in 1971, I believe, right, is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and that comes about in part, I guess, or maybe in whole, due to his relationship with Rolling Stone, right? I mean, at some point he gets to know Jan Wenner and the Rolling Stone people, and that begins a very fruitful relationship for him, or intermittently fruitful, I should say.
So this part of his life was when most of his great work was written, and when you actually try and put down the chronology of it, it's very complicated because he was doing these classic works, his most important works. He was quite often doing them at the same time, or taking a break to go here, to do that, come back this, and then pick up there. So he got into politics, running this thing called Freak Power, and
in Woody Creek or in Aspen.
Pitkin Counties, that's the area around Aspen, and he was trying to be the sheriff of Aspen, the first masculine guzzling sheriff of Aspen he would have been. And he reached out to Jan Wenner and wrote about his campaign for Rolling Stone, wrote this huge thing, and they got along really well because Jan Wenner was very much like, oh yeah, if you need 1,000 words or 5,000, 10,000, even 20,000 words is okay. Do whatever you want. And Hunter really could not do short form stuff, so he got along well with Wenner in the beginning and wrote that. And then he's working on another piece with Oscar Zeta Acosta about the murder of a Hispanic journalist in Los Angeles.
And Oscar becomes the attorney character in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Yeah, so he's Dr. Gonzo. And he really was very much Dr. Gonzo. There, he kind of created that character and spoke many of those lines. But during the work that they did on that article, things became difficult and quite dangerous. And the Oscar's associates didn't really like the idea of a white journalist being in their neighborhood. And so they decided to take off for a weekend in Las Vegas. And so they went to Las Vegas for a weekend, and they didn't do any drugs. They just got really, really, really drunk, and then they went back home. And Hunter started writing this down, kind of pulling upon his actual experiences with drugs, because he'd done a lot of acid in the 60s, a bit of mescaline in 1970. And he started kind of taking his drug visions and imposing them upon Las Vegas, to imagine that he and Acosta had not just been drunk, but they were roaming around on acid, which by then was illegal. And the point being, what's the difference between, your average drunk and the people rolling on acid and ether and cocaine? They're indistinguishable. And what's the difference between an acid vision and the reality of Las Vegas, right? So
right.
It was I think it's one of the great books of the last century. That I think that was an absolute masterpiece. Oh yeah, so they went to Las Vegas for one weekend and then came back, and he was working on this story, and someone in the Rolling Stone offices then said there's going to be a district attorney's conference in Las Vegas, and I think this would have been about a month or 2 months later. And so they go back and sort of infiltrate the DA convention. And this time they did have a small amount of drugs with them.
But nothing like
But
what was described in the book.
no, not at all. That never existed, unfortunately. They certainly tore up their hotel room. They caused ungodly scenes. There's one scene that was cut out of the book but is in the film of Acosta smashing a coconut with a sledgehammer on the hood of their rented car. That happened. Yeah, Acosta was kind of the driving force behind that, though. He wasn't just inspiration. He sure as hell wasn't just a sidekick. I mean, when you listen to their tape recordings, and because Hunter was obsessed with tape recorders, he always had one sitting beside him in his car seat. And sometimes he liked to put the microphone in his sleeve if he was being surreptitious, or sometimes it was just recording everything. But I mean, you can hear Acosta is saying, we're here to find the American dream. We've got to go there. We've got to go interview these waitresses. And everything he does, that ends up in the book, which is why he was so pissed off with Hunter Thompson after kind of getting no credit for any of that.
Well, Hunter Thompson knew he had a great character, and he knew how to, like, I don't know. I kind of get why Acosta would have been pissed. But Acosta could have written a book. I mean, I don't know.
He did. Wrote two.
I know, but I'm just saying he could have written his Fear and Loathing. Thompson did it, you know. I guess like it's the old Joan Didion thing about how writers are they're always stealing from you or they're selling you out, you know. Like he should have known who he was with, and the rest is history, as they say. But you know, I don't want to keep you forever, but I do want to ask a question about how Hunter hit the high watermark of his style and of his gonzo journalism or gonzo literary nonfiction or whatever you want to call it with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Maybe it's just a simple case of like, this is a guy hitting his peak. He was I don't know how old he would have been then, 30, early 30s.
Let's see, he was born in 1937, so yeah, mid 30s by then.
So is that it? I mean, he had his apprenticeship, he had honed it, gotten it to where he needed to get it, and then had the opportunity, and it just came together? Or were there certain circumstances in his life otherwise that you think contributed? Or was the editorial relationship with Wenner crucial? Or, you know?
All of the above, maybe. He'd certainly spent a decade and a half really intensely crafting his writing abilities and himself as a character, as a personality. He would become Raoul Duke. He was observing everything. He was very interested in the evils of what he saw as Nixon and, I guess, conservatism in the United States. And he was fascinated by the counterculture of the 1960s. And so when you've got all of this coming together, and he's really hit his peak as a writer, and he really feels like there's something to be said, and he's really in this intensely experimental mode, and he's been given absolute freedom. I mean, Wenner would have published anything he wrote at that stage. And then by chance, he goes to Las Vegas, and I think he looks around, and he says, "This is awful. This is just the weirdest, most artificial place in the world. And everything I see is the embodiment of Nixonian values. These are the assholes who voted for Nixon, all these people around me." And he's at the same time looking back, and he wants to say something about the 60s. Like, he wants to have the definitive statement, the sort of the epitaph for the 60s. And of course, he's done all of this stuff in small doses here and there. So he starts pulling on things that he's written. He starts picking up on phrases, on rhythms, on patterns of punctuation that he's used. The idea of a wave, like his most famous piece of writing, the wave moving across America, breaking in San Francisco and rolling back. You follow his letters for about 4 years, and he's just trying to get the wave to mean something. He's trying to get this. He's got this idea of a wave of energy, but he just doesn't know how to do it just yet. And when he's in Las Vegas, these ideas are just coming to him, and he starts scrawling notes down on napkins, and he starts driving home, and he has to stop, and he's filling this notebook of more ideas and scenes, supposedly that later end up in the book. And I think it all came together, and it kind of was a magical thing. I mean, how does any great work of art come together? Yeah, it's planned a little bit, and yes, the artist has put in his time and developed his skills or her skills, but there's a certain dose of serendipity as well. There's a little bit of magic.
Well, I want to have you read the High White Note, the famous High White Note from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, if you have it handy. It's the one that I think a lot of my listeners will probably be familiar with, but it's worth hearing in this context since we're talking about it.
Okay, so this is just a short portion, which is good because I'm not a great reader, and also there are copyright considerations. So this is the start of what is affectionately known as the wave passage. Strange memories on this nervous night in Las Vegas. 5 years later, 6, it seems like a lifetime, or at least a main era, the kind of peak that never comes again. San Francisco in the middle 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. Maybe it meant something, maybe not, in the long run, but no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of time in the world, whatever it meant.
And then it goes on to describe how the wave broke eventually,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And so...
Which I believe he basically took from the final pages of The Great Gatsby. I think he was trying to rewrite that essentially and update it for his generation.
Okay. This is one of the high white notes of your biography, if I may, David, because you do a magisterial job of drawing that comparison. I hadn't thought of that. And not only do you think of that on the page, but you actually like get scientific about it, and you start to bust out like the rhyme and meter of that closing passage in The Great Gatsby and compare it to the wave passage in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And what you find is that they're strikingly similar in their music, and that if you draw out a wave pattern, it looks like a wave,
Yeah.
like a big giant tidal wave. So it's a really impressive observation and a level of attention to detail when it comes to the language. And I think, how intentional was that? Like, was he thinking of those things when he wrote it? Who knows? It seems more like it was just so embedded in him and intuited because he had internalized all that and had been practicing for all these years that it came out that way. But I think it brings into focus why it works so well and why it's such a classic, like why is a classic? And well, part of the reason might be because this guy spent 20 years trying to write his version of The Great Gatsby and used to type in the entire book, start to finish to sort of learn how it was done. Like he really had internalized that music, right? It wasn't just like he loved the book, like he really studied it.
Yeah, I mean, he annotated his copy in incredible detail, and so he said publicly a number of times that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was his attempt at doing The Great Gatsby. And because of, as you said, he'd typed out parts of the books and he'd annotated in intense detail the book, and he really wanted to copy different parts. I don't think it was necessarily an accident. I think it was a conscious effort. I think he believed that was Fitzgerald's high white note, and he wanted that to be his. And he would have read these. It's about a page and a half of Fitzgerald. He would have probably read that hundreds of times in his life. So it would have been utterly embedded in his head. But yeah, I noticed when I was reading them, I'd read both books, of course, dozens of times myself, and I have this. I always see patterns in things when I look at them, and I started to notice the patterns of punctuation that he had used, and the lengths of sentences and the number of clauses or breaths per sentence. And I thought this, it can't be an accident. And the more I compared them, the more I realized they were more or less exactly the same. And yeah, I think that is probably the best part of this book, but largely because I think it dispels the idea of Hunter as just this careless drug writer, and shows the level of craft that actually went into his work.
Hmm. But, and we're going to have to let readers read about Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail and the kind of back half of Hunter Thompson's career, which is significantly less notable, though does have some high points journalistically. There were times when he was careless in his life and in his personal life and in his creative life. And it's poetic and a little bit poignant to know, reading this book, that gonzo journalism as a style or as a thing was sort of born by accident in the throes of a terrible hangover after the Kentucky Derby, when he basically like fried his wires. He couldn't write. That was what gonzo journalism was born out of a hangover. And it's so hard to write when you're stone sober, or like on like 2 cups of strong coffee with a full night of sleep, like when you're feeling at your best. It's hard to write then. The fact that this guy was able to write with the kinds of hangovers that he had all throughout his adult life, and these are not just like alcohol. This is cocaine every day. Like the back half of his life just feels to me like one long hangover to a certain extent, and you can't function as a human being, and certainly as a writer, at the top of your game for any length of time. I think what happened is that he would kind of break through sometimes and do it in short bursts, but he just had dulled his instrument so much that it just became harder and harder and more frustrating. And
yeah,
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Cocaine was the problem, or cocaine exacerbated an underlying problem. But he also had this theory that he explained to Jan Wenner about the use of drugs as a writer. It's not doing anything magical. It's allowing you to tap, I think his words were, latent energy resources. So you're kind of borrowing energy from yourself that you're possibly never going to be able to pay back. And there's an argument to be made that he went so hard during a short period of time that he kind of burned out, to use a cliche. And the latter half of his career, he was just never able to get that energy again. Or at least that's possibly a part of it.
I was just going to say, I just know how bad my hangovers are at this age. Like, I'm worthless. Like, I don't even drink anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like, forget it. It's not worth it to me. Like, I can't function, and the fact that he had that kind of constitution, and, granted, if you're drinking and you're doing cocaine all day, every day, or all night, every night, I guess, because he slept during the days, but, maybe there's some mixture of it that you can get to something close to functional. He was surprisingly functional, considering how messed up he was a lot of the time. But I'm sure there were some low moments where he wasn't, and especially as his health started to deteriorate. Before I let you go, I want to know a little bit about the research process for this book. And I know that you visited Owl Farm at some point, right? You actually went to Woody Creek and showed up there and got to kind of see it with your own eyes, right?
So that happened before the research part of the book. This was 2010. And Hunter Thompson's neighbor, Wayne Ewing, has directed a number of films, documentaries about Hunter. And I had been friends with him for a number of years, and I went to visit him in Colorado. And when I arrived, he said, Anita, Hunter's widow, said she wants to meet you. So do you want to go up to the farm? And I said, yeah, of course. It's kind of a dream come true. I was a little embarrassed because I I'd been traveling for days, and I only had, well, I always just wear a black T-shirt, but it was the only thing I had, and I've got this Hunter Thompson tattoo on my arm here,
Well,
and
let
I
me
thought,
see
oh
it. Let me
God,
see it.
that's
What does it look like?
it's the
Is it a Oh, it's the
Gonzo
gun.
logo, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought that's embarrassing. I'm going to come across as like such a childish fan, you know. That we got up there, and it was very odd because they were filming a TV show at the time, and there were all these people who I knew from Hunter's books, and I could see the farm and the kitchen where he killed himself and everything, and I was really very overwhelmed, and I was struggling with the altitude and the other things that they have at Owl Farm, and they I just kind of sat there. I didn't know what to say, and I managed to have a conversation with his widow, although I didn't say too much to anyone else there. But a couple of weeks ago, or no, maybe 2 3 months ago, I was on archive.org and I was looking for Hunter Thompson stuff, and I saw this weird thumbnail, and it sparked this memory, and it was because when they were filming the TV show, the camera was behind me at one point, and so it was my line of sight during most of that TV show at Owl Farm in the living room. And I watched the video, and at some point the camera does pan around, and there's me sitting there with Wayne, looking very nervous and out of my depth.
Sweating.
And there was only 3 views in that video for the last 12 years. I guess probably two robots and me.
Time marches on, man. But
But
did you
yeah,
work with like the estate, or did you have access to papers or anything like that for this book, or was the cooperation low?
yeah, they have. I'll be careful what I say, but they have very little interest in maintaining his literary legacy, and they have not been cooperative. So what I did off of the research I could find myself. Luckily, I know a lot of people in the Hunter Thompson world, the people that have taken it upon themselves to gather his materials, to gather his unpublished papers. But as for the estate, that's a complicated legal situation, and it has not really resulted in anything worthwhile. There's still no open archive to the public, although one is in the process of opening, but that's a private collector who's been good enough to do that out of his own pocket without the help of this state. And Johnny Depp owns the rest of the Hunter's archives.
Yeah,
And
did you talk to Johnny Depp?
no, I was not able to get in contact with Johnny Depp. So I was having to track down all the single items that you could find that are not the sort of core collection from Owl Farm. Fortunately, there was plenty for me to work on. I never really encountered a point when I couldn't, but it would have been nice to go to a place where they have everything together. When I wrote my book about William S. Burroughs, I went to the New York Public Library, and you just sat there for a week and you just fill out the form for the different things you need. But for Hunter Thompson, no, I was researching all of every day for 2 years and then writing the book out all of every day for 1 year. It was an exhaustive process, really.
I bet. And
Hence
it's
why
a
I live
shame.
in Cambodia.
I was going to say, and they need to. I thought after he died that Owl Farm would eventually become a kind of museum. I guess it's a little
It's in
bit
the
macabre
process.
is it okay? Because like I know it's a little bit macabre because he killed himself there, but
Yeah.
um, that place is so associated with him and his work, and it's where that was his home base. He loved it there in Woody Creek, and
Hmm.
I've eaten at the tavern. My family, taken my family to the tavern, which is still there, and that was kind of his hangout, and his spirit definitely still looms large there. But I thought it would become a museum. I really do hope that the various figures involved with his literary estate and his materials get their act together, because I think it's a valuable archive. He was a witness to a lot of history and was a
Mm.
singular voice for sure, and just such a funny figure. You know, this kind of outlaw guy with a press pass tripping in the White House briefing room or whatever. Like that will never not be funny to me. And it really is only possible once, you know, like
Yeah.
no one can do that now. You know what I'm saying? Like he did it. He was the guy who did it. And I don't know, just a hero and one of the truly funny literary writers that I've ever read.
Yeah, I hope they do turn it into a museum. I hope they get the archive into a university, because it's been more than 15 years since he died. In fact, it's pushing closer to 20 years, and he's still not gotten the respect that he deserves, because it's incredibly difficult for people to research his life, and he's in danger of sort of just fading off into distant history unless something is done.
Mm.
That's why I've written this book, and there are other people out there doing their own projects, and luckily we've got a small community of really dedicated people, and I hope that the estate and others kind of get their act together, because he wanted to be viewed as a serious writer, a serious comic writer, and he deserves to be.
Well, it's interesting. I had Juan on this show years ago. I don't know if you ever heard that episode, but when he wrote his memoir about his experiences growing up as the son of Hunter Thompson, he came to my house, and I was struck by how soft spoken, almost like monkish in temperament, if I could put it that way, like sort of the exact opposite of what you might expect from Hunter Thompson's son. You know, you kind of come into it expecting him to be
It's very
wilder.
shy, very
Very
shy.
shy, very shy, and very sweet. And we had a good talk, and I enjoyed reading his book. But, you know, it struck me when I was reading your book, the quote from Sandy, his ex-wife, and how she basically said he failed. You know, she really had a bearish assessment of his achievements as a literary writer, that he didn't do what he set out to do. And you know what? Because I grapple with that, right? I was reading it. I was like, wow, she sounds angry. But she also had the closest view, and she took a lot of shit from him. He was abusive and difficult and awful to her. And they went through a lot together. I mean, this is another thing, is that they lost a child together, right? They had
At least one,
at least one. So this is another loss that Hunter Thompson sort of never spoke of. And I was grappling with Sandy's assessment of his failure. And maybe he did not become the great novelist that he set out to be. He did not become, you know, F. Scott Fitzgerald writing The Great Gatsby. I think that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is a novel, but it's closer to new journalism. You know, the stuff that he did was closer to that sort of literary nonfiction or autofiction, I guess they might call it now, where you're making some stuff up, but it's mostly drawn from fact, and you yourself are in the book. And I guess where I stand on it, and I'd love to hear in closing, you know, where you are, is that yes, he failed to achieve what he set out to do as he defined it as a young man. But eventually he became himself, for better and for worse. And he wrote what he was meant to write. I feel like he got his work done. And yes, it was wildly uneven, you know, in the back half. And it had to be, because he was a drug addict who was destroying himself. But when he was good, he was very, very good. And if you look at the totality of what he wrote a lot. You know, he wrote, like you say, 3 really good books that will stand the test of time. I think, you know, Hell's Angels, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. Those are significant books from the 20th century. And I think if you interviewed or took a poll of writers and asked if they would be satisfied with writing 3 standout books in their lifetime, and a lot of like really high profile journalism, I mean, most people would take that.
I mean, he wrote a book that defined an era, and he wrote a book that is the definitive political book of its century almost. I mean, these weren't just 1 or 2 good books. That brief period when he was on form, although only lasted sadly 5 years or so, he produced so much absolutely magnificent work that the next 3 decades of crap could be completely forgiven. And as you say, yeah, ask any writer, would you trade decades of suffering for the most important book of your era? Yeah, everyone would say yes to that, wouldn't they? Right? I mean, it's just a work of absolute genius, and that can never be taken away from him, no matter what he wrote afterwards.
Well, I could not help but think as I was reading, what would Hunter Thompson think if he could read David's book? I have to believe you've considered that, because you are, the people who read this book will know, like, you are unsparing. When you think he is not informed, you say so. And when you think he's awful, you say, I think he's awful. My take, and then I'll let you go. My take is that if you showed up at Owl Farm and Hunter Thompson had read this, he would have fired shots at you. I think I think he would have had a rifle, and I think he would have chased you off of his property with a rifle shooting at you. But I think deep down he would have respected the swing that you take here and the seriousness with which you tried to assess his work and the honesty. Like, as a journalist and as a truth seeker and as a writer himself, I feel like he would have hated a lot of what you had to say, but I feel like he probably would have respected it in the end.
So one of his best friends read the book and sent me a message, and there's a paragraph in that email that I really want blown up and framed and put on my wall. And it says, if Hunter read this, he would have said, I hate it. But then he would have muttered, well done, you bastard.
Yeah.
So, because he hates anything that makes him look bad. But yeah.
Well, of course. No, but I mean, listen, no writer would love to read the bad parts of their life and their work. It's got to be so awkward to be alive and to have to face a biography. I can't imagine reading something like that. But I don't think his literary legacy can be perpetuated in the absence of this kind of serious assessment. And kudos to you for taking it on. Is the David S. Wills, is the S in your name any kind of homage to the Hunter S. Thompson? I mean, when you were a young David, were you like, you know what, I have the S? Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just dropped it in there.
So I got some shit about this when I wrote my William S. Burroughs book as well. People asked the same question. I said, there was already a David Wills who writes books about Jacques Derrida. And I thought, well, I kind of need to differentiate, so I had to go for the pretentious middle initial.
What does it stand for?
Stephen. I mean, it's actually my middle name. It's my dad's name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you working on anything new? Where can people find you, and what do you got going?
Right. I mean, the book, it can be found on Amazon, or I guess anywhere you can buy a book. I guess it's in a bunch of libraries as well. At the moment, I just finished the second draft of a novel, which is nice because I never thought I could write fiction. I thought I had an actual inability to do it. So to finish even a kind of ugly draft of a novel was one of my great personal achievements recently. And I'm almost finished a book on Haruki Murakami, the Japanese novelist. So after having done Burroughs, Ginsberg, and Thompson, this is kind of a change of pace. It's also going to be much more academic than the previous three. It's just to sort of fulfill a certain obligation to a university publisher. But he's a writer I really admire, and it'll be the first living writer I've actually tackled as well. So that'll be an interesting one. But yeah, the idea of that is my theory is that every one of his novels is a depiction of trauma told through his own version of magical realism, which emulates the sensation of dissociation. And so I've gone through his books and tried to show that. But both of those, I'll spend the rest of this year working on them, and maybe they'll be out next year, hopefully. We'll see.
Well, and where do you live online?
Beatdom.com or davidswills.com.
Okay. Well, David, it's a pleasure to talk with you. Congratulations on High White Notes and all that you have going. and your cool life in Cambodia with your $300 a month rent and your concussions and your dengue fever. Well, what a romantic life you're living over there.
I wish everyone could have as many concussions as I've had, Brad.
Well, listen,
But
it's great to talk to you.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for having me.